To walk through the town of Villisca, Iowa in the year 1912 was to walk through the heart of the American dream. It was a place of iron and soil, of steam engines and church bells, a community of 2,000 souls bound together by the hard work of the prairie and the absolute certainty of their safety. In 1912, the Iron Horse Railroad brought progress, news, and wealth to the town. But on the night of June 9th, it may have brought something else, something ancient, something cold. We often think of history as a series of dates and names, but history is also a collection of silences. And in the early hours of Monday, June 10th, a silence fell over a small white cottage on East 2nd Street. A silence so profound, so heavy, that it would echo for the next 100 years. Chapter 1. The Final Hymn. Sunday, June 9th, was a day of celebration. It was Children's Day at the local Presbyterian church. For the Moore family, it was a day of pride. Josiah Moore, 43, was the town's most successful businessman. He was a man of action, a man who had built a farm implement empire from nothing. His wife, Sarah, 39, was the light of his life and the pillar of the church's social circle. They were accompanied by their 4 children, Herman, 11, Catherine, 10, Boyd, 7, and Paul, 5. They were vibrant, healthy children, dressed in their Sunday best, lace ribbons and polished shoes. Joining them were 2 friends of the family, Lena and Ina Stillinger, aged 12 and 8, who had traveled from their family farm to stay the night. The church service was a tapestry of hymns and laughter. The children recited verses and sang songs of innocence. As the service ended around 9:30 p.m., the humid night air was thick with the scent of blooming peonies and approaching rain. The Moore family and the Stillinger sisters walked the few blocks home. They arrived at the house around 9:45 p.m. They shared a light snack of milk and cookies. Josiah, usually a man of habit, did something he rarely felt the need to do. He locked the front and back doors. By 10:30 p.m., the lights in the house were extinguished. The house was still. But the house was not empty. Sometime earlier that evening, while the family was at church, a shadow had entered the home. Someone had watched them leave. Someone had climbed the narrow, creaking stairs to the cramped attic crawl space. There, among the cobwebs and the dust of summer, a stranger sat in the suffocating heat. He sat and he waited. He listened to the family come home. He listened to the floorboards groan under their weight. He waited until the rhythmic breathing of sleep filled the rooms, and in his hands he gripped the cold, heavy handle of Josiah Moore's own axe, a tool taken from the woodpile just hours before. Chapter 2. The Anatomy of an Atrocity. The clock in the hallway ticked toward midnight. The storm outside provided a rhythmic percussion of rain against the window panes. The killer began his descent. He moved first to the master bedroom on the 2nd floor. In the darkness, the shapes of Josiah and Sarah Moore were barely visible beneath the quilts. The killer did not use the blade of the axe. He chose the blunt end, the heavy, square pole. He wanted to crush. The first blow landed with a sickening, wet thud. The force was so catastrophic that the axe head struck the low ceiling on the backswing, leaving deep, permanent gouges in the plaster that survive to this day as scars of that night. Josiah never woke up. His skull was pulverized in a matter of seconds. Sarah Moore was next. The brutality was not a frenzy. It was a cold, systematic erasure. From the master bedroom, the shadow drifted into the children's room. Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. They died in their sleep, never knowing that the safety of their home had been breached by a monster. The youngest, Paul, was struck with the same crushing precision as his father. But the most chilling discovery lay downstairs. In the guest room on the first floor, Lena and Ina Stillinger were asleep in a double bed. Here, the pattern changed. Forensic experts who examined the scene decades later noted that Lena, the 12-year-old, was the only victim with defensive wounds. She had woken up. She had felt the presence in the dark. In the pitch black of a strange house, she had reached out her hand, perhaps thinking it was a dream, only to be met with the cold steel of the axe. She had tried to scramble away. She had fought for her life in the silence. A single bloody handprint was found on the wall near the headboard, a silent scream frozen in time. Chapter 3. The Ritual of the Bacon. The massacre was over in less than 20 minutes. 8 lives had been extinguished, but the killer was not finished. He did not flee into the night. What followed were series of bizarre ritualistic acts that defy modern psychological profiling. The killer moved through the house with a kerosene lamp, its wick turned so low it barely cast a glow. He took every mirror in the house and covered them with cloths and discarded clothing. He took the bed sheets and draped them over the faces of the dead, hiding the carnage he had created. Was it a moment of sudden, overwhelming remorse? Or was it the ancient, dark superstition that the eyes of the dead can act as a camera, recording the face of their killer for eternity? Then the killer went to the kitchen. He opened the icebox. He removed a 2-pound slab of raw bacon. He wrapped it carefully in a kitchen towel and carried it into the guest room, placing it on the floor next to the blood-stained axe. He took a bowl of water and washed his hands, leaving the water pink and stagnant in the basin. He wandered the house like a ghost, looking at the covered faces, listening to the rain. He even took a plate of uneaten punch and cookies and placed it on the table, a strange, silent offering in a house of corpses. Finally, as the first gray light of dawn touched the Iowa horizon, he slipped out the back door and vanished into the mist. Chapter 4. The Morning After. At 7:30 a.m. on Monday, June 10th, the sun was shining on East 2nd Street. The neighbor, Mary Peckham, noticed something was wrong. Usually, Sarah Moore was early to rise, hanging laundry or feeding the chickens. But the Moore house was silent. The curtains were drawn, an usual sight for a summer morning. Mary knocked on the door. No answer. She tried the handle. It was locked. Concerned, she called Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. Ross arrived and used his spare key. He stepped into the dim, humid hallway. The air was thick and smelled of iron. He walked toward the guest room and pushed the door open. He saw 2 shapes under the covers, dark stains soaking into the pillows. He did not wait to see more. Ross Moore ran out onto the porch, his face white as ash, clutching his throat. "Something is wrong," he gasped. "There is blood everywhere." Within an hour, the quiet town of Villisca was a scene of chaos. There was no police tape in 1912. Hundreds of townspeople, men, women, and even children rushed into the house. They trampled the floors, touched the walls, and looked at the bodies. They destroyed almost every piece of physical evidence before a single photograph could be taken. The town had been violated, and in their panic, they were destroying the only clues that could have led to the killer. Chapter 5. The Senator's Grudge. As the news of the massacre spread across the telegraph wires of America, the hunt for the killer began. The first major suspect was a man of immense power, State Senator Frank Jones. Jones was a titan of Villisca. He was a man who demanded loyalty and punished betrayal. Josiah Moore had once been Jones's most trusted employee, but years earlier, Josiah had left Jones's firm to start his own competing business. He took with him the lucrative John Deere contract. The feud was bitter and public. Jones felt Josiah had stolen his livelihood. Josiah felt Jones was a tyrant. In the small-town politics of Iowa, this was a war. A private investigator named James Wilkerson became obsessed with the idea that Jones had hired a hitman to eliminate the Moore family forever. Wilkerson pointed to a man named William Blackie Mansfield, a professional killer who had been linked to other axe murders. Wilkerson spent years trying to prove that Jones had paid Mansfield to silence his rival forever. But the senator's influence was vast. The grand jury refused to indict. The town was torn in two, those who believed their senator was a murderer, and those who believed Josiah Moore had simply made the wrong.
Chapter 6. The Mad Preacher. If Senator Frank Jones represented the cold, calculated motive of business and revenge, the second major suspect represented something far more chaotic, something darker. His name was Reverend Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly. He was a tiny, frail man with thick glasses and a history of severe mental instability. Kelly was a traveling preacher who had arrived in Villisca on June 8th to attend the Children's Day services. Even before the murders, Kelly was noticed by the townspeople. He was seen wandering the streets, mumbling to himself, and watching the Moore children with an intensity that made many feel uneasy. But in the early 20th century, eccentric preachers were common, and his behavior was dismissed as religious fervor. On the morning of June 10th, just hours after the murders were committed but hours before the bodies were discovered, Reverend Kelly boarded a 5 a.m. train leaving Villisca. Passengers later reported that Kelly seemed agitated. He told a stranger on the train that there were 8 souls butchered in their beds back in Villisca. How could he have known? Years later, Kelly was brought back to Iowa to face trial. In a chilling confession, he admitted to the killings. He claimed that a divine voice, the voice of God, had commanded him to slay utterly and spare not. He described the layout of the Moore house in terrifying detail. He spoke of the attic where he had waited. He spoke of the feeling of the axe in his hand. But the trial was a circus. Kelly's lawyers argued that he was a victim of his own delusions, a man so mentally broken that he would confess to any horror just to feel significant. They pointed out that his confession was obtained after hours of interrogation. In the end, despite 2 trials, the jury could not reach a unanimous decision. The Reverend was acquitted, leaving the town of Villisca with a confession but no conviction. Chapter 7. The Ritual and the Psyche. To understand the killer, we must look away from the suspects and look back at the house itself, specifically at the rituals. Why cover the mirrors? Why cover the faces of the dead? In 1912, psychological profiling didn't exist, but modern criminologists have studied the Villisca scene for decades. Covering the faces of victims is often seen in crimes where the killer has a personal connection to the family, an act of undoing the horror, as if hiding the eyes prevents the dead from judging the living. But then there is the bacon. A 2-pound slab of raw pork wrapped in a towel left on the floor. Some believe this was a signature, a bizarre mark of an itinerant killer. Others suggest it was an offering. In some ancient folk traditions, meat was left at the scene of a death to appease the spirits. This wasn't the work of a panicked amateur. This was someone who felt comfortable in a house filled with the dead, someone who took their time, someone who moved through the darkness with the familiarity of a shadow. Chapter 8. The Man from the Train. Perhaps the most terrifying theory is that the Axeman was not from Villisca at all. Between 1911 and 1912, a wave of axe murders swept through the American Midwest and the South. from Colorado Springs to Monmouth, Illinois, from Ellsworth, Kansas to New Orleans. The patterns were always the same. The victims were families. They were killed in their beds at night. The killer used the blunt end of an axe. The mirrors were covered. The windows were draped with cloths. Historians have pointed to a man named Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the Villisca Moors. He was a drifter who had been released from prison just before the killings began. Everywhere Henry Lee Moore went, bodies were found in the same ritualistic state. If this theory is true, it means that the Villisca Axeman was one of America's first nomadic serial killers. A phantom who traveled the rails, stepped off into a quiet town, erased a family, and then boarded the next train before the sun rose. Chapter 9. The Stain That Never Fades. The house on East 2nd Street did not stay empty, but it never felt inhabited again. Over the next century, various families tried to live within those white-framed walls. None stayed long. They spoke of cold spots in the middle of summer. They spoke of the sound of a heavy tool dragging across the attic floor. They spoke of a child's voice whispering from the guest room. In 1994, the house was purchased and restored to its original 1912 condition. No electricity, no running water. It became a destination for those who seek the macabre. That same year, a paranormal investigator staying the night was found with a self-inflicted stab wound to the chest. He survived, but he had no explanation for why he had done it. He simply said the house had commanded him. Today, the house remains a monument to a tragedy that has no ending. The gouges in the ceiling are still there. The memory of the 8 souls is still there. And somewhere in the dusty archives of Iowa, the name of the killer is written. We just haven't found it yet. The tragedy of Villisca isn't just that they died, it's that they were never given the justice of a name. Sleep well, and remember, the shadow in the corner is usually just the dark. Usually.
Chapter 10. The Circus of Justice. Justice in 1912 was not a laboratory science. It was a theater of the mind. By the time Reverend Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly was brought to trial in 1917, the town of Villisca had been marinating in fear and suspicion for 5 years. The courtroom was packed. People brought picnic lunches to watch a man fight for his life against a crime that seemed committed by a demon. The prosecution's star witness was a fellow passenger on the train Kelly had boarded the morning after the murders. The witness testified that Kelly was sweating, despite the cool morning air. He claimed Kelly leaned in and whispered, "There is a terrible tragedy in Villisca. 8 people have been sent to their maker." When the defense took the stand, they painted a different picture. They showed a man who was a pathological confessor. They brought forth doctors who testified that Kelly suffered from religious melancholia. He was a man who saw himself as a prophet, and in his broken mind, taking credit for a massacre was a way to achieve a dark immortality. The most harrowing moment of the trial came when the jury was taken to the house itself. They stood in the very rooms where the blood had pooled. They looked at the gouges in the ceiling. The defense pointed out a physical impossibility. Kelly was a small, frail man, barely 5 feet tall. Could he have swung a heavy axe with enough force to penetrate the skulls of 8 people and leave marks on a 7-foot ceiling, all without making a sound that alerted the neighbors? The jury was deadlocked, 11-1 for acquittal. In the second trial, he was found not guilty. Kelly walked free, but he remained a ghost in the American psyche. He died in a mental institution years later, still whispering about the work of the Lord in a small Iowa town. Chapter 11. The Phantom of the Rails. While Villisca tore itself apart over local suspects, a much larger shadow was moving across the United States, a shadow that historians now call the man from the train. Between 1911 and 1912, a terrifying pattern emerged. In Colorado Springs, a family was slaughtered with an axe. In Monmouth, Illinois, another family. In Ellsworth, Kansas, yet another. In every case, the house was near a railroad track. In every case, the killer used the blunt end of an axe. And in every case, the mirrors were covered. This suggests a nomadic predator, a man who used the American railroad system as his hunting ground. He would step off a freight train at dusk, select a house near the tracks, wait in the attic or a crawl space, and commit his liturgy of blood before catching the 4 a.m. locomotive out of town. Researchers have focused on Henry Lee Moore. He was an axe-wielding drifter who had murdered his own mother and grandmother. The timeline of his movements across the Midwest matches the dates of the axe wave with terrifying precision. If Henry Lee Moore was the killer, then Josiah Moore's decision to lock his doors that night was a futile gesture against a man who was already inside, waiting in the heat of the attic. Chapter 13. The Psychology of the Shadow. Why cover the mirrors? Why the bacon? These aren't just details, they are a window into a shattered mind. Psychologists suggest that covering mirrors is a form of depersonalization. The killer cannot look at himself. He cannot bear the reflection of the monster he has become. By covering the mirrors and the faces of the dead, he creates a world where nobody is watching, a world where he is alone with his work. The bacon remains the ultimate enigma. Some criminal profilers believe it was an act of pique, a taunt left for the police. Others believe it was part of a twisted domestic fantasy. The killer had destroyed a family, and by placing the bacon, a symbol of a family breakfast, near the weapon, he was settling in to the home he had just stolen. Chapter 14. The Eternal Vigil. Today, the house on East 2nd Street is no longer just a house. It is a portal. Paranormal investigators from around the world flock to Villisca, armed with sensors and recorders, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man in the attic. They record electronic voice phenomena, children's voices saying, "He's coming," or "Don't tell." They see the curtains move when there is no wind. But perhaps the most haunted thing about the house is the town itself. Villisca never grew. It stayed frozen in time, a community forever defined by a single night in 1912. The Axeman taught us a lesson we haven't forgotten, that evil doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes it sits in our churches, sometimes it rivals us in business, and sometimes it's just a stranger who stepped off a train looking for a place to spend the night. The file on the Villisca Axe Murders will never be closed, because as long as the house stands and as long as the corn grows in the Iowa fields, the question will remain. Who was the man in the attic? We may never know his name, but we know his work, and his work is eternal. Sleep well, if you can.